Before the reading of the poem, there are a few words that should be added to each student's lexicon. These definitions were found through the online Oxford Dictionary.
Bedight on line 1 means adornment or decoration, referring to happiness.
Gallant on line 2 means brave or heroic.
O'er on line 9 is a poetic or literary contraction for the word over.
Eldorado, written by Edgar Allan Poe in 1849.
Gaily bedight, a gallant knight in sunshine and in shadow, had journeyed long, singing a song in search of Eldorado.
But he grew old, this knight so bold, and o'er his heart a shadow fell as he found a spot of ground that looked like Eldorado.
And as his strength failed him at length, he met a pilgrim shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of Eldorado?
Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley the shadow. Ride, boldly ride, the shade replied, if you seek for Eldorado. The poem has a repeated reference to Eldorado, which according to sources such as the National Geographic website, has a tale that determines Eldorado as the city of gold. The 16th and 17th century Europeans believed that there was a city with plenty of opportunities for wealth through immense amounts of gold. During their time, this tale was believed by many people and caused many searchers of Eldorado to be killed, some even by suicide.
The historical context of the poem is related to the gold rush in California during the time that the poem was written, in 1849. At this time, the gold rush was occurring where many people across the nation fled to California in search of gold. Before the gold rush of 1849, the population of California was around 14,000, not including Native Americans. After many Americans found out about this unowned treasure, the population grew to around 100,000 people. This is significant because it relates to Poe's greed he had from a young age, constantly demanding money from his wealthy father.
Poe's adopted father, John Allan, was very wealthy and only gave Edgar 1/3 of the amount of money that he wanted when he was becoming an adult. This was 23 years before the poem was written, showing that this was a grudge that Poe had held in for his father. Poe's anger about this event has an effect on the connection between greed, the city of gold, and death. The speaker of the poem tells about a courageous knight who goes on a joyous adventure trying to find the city of Eldorado. As he grows old and tired, he meets a pilgrim figure. This pilgrim figure gives him directions to the city and tells him to boldly ride on to Eldorado. The initial interpretation was that one should be persistent when trying to achieve goals.
Based upon the historical and cultural context, Gothic components, and evidence provided through the literary conventions, the interpretation of the poem was created. Having the shadow resemble death to hell, and Eldorado being the city of gold, expressing one's self-desire for personal wealth, creates the interpretation that striving for greed will bring self-destruction, eventually leading to one's death. The period before Poe's era, during the Gothic literary movement, was called the American Romanticism movement. These poems would use a hero that would have to defeat many challenges and obstacles in their way in order to solve their personal mysteries. Other components of romantic literature are individualism, distrust, and disbelief. In Eldorado, the hero would be the knight, whose personal mystery is seeking the land of gold. The knight shows individualism by focusing on self-greed. The distrust and disbelief appears when he is unable to find Eldorado and eventually rides on to his own death.
In Poe's era, Gothic elements were presented through the tone and mood of the literature. These were used in order to terrorize using the reoccurring theme of death. In Eldorado, there is also a reference to the supernatural when the knight meets the ghostly shadow. Here, this Gothic element shows the use of supernatural figures in Poe's literature, showing an important part of his time of writing. This shapes meaning by showing that the knight has died and is communicating with paranormal figures.
In the early stanzas of this poem, the knight is referred to as brave and courageous. Happily singing and continuing on his journey, the knight is confident in himself that he will reach the city of gold, thus obtaining his personal riches. The knight is seen as the hero of the poem, but as the poem continues on, the hero becomes less heroic. Each stanza's mood increases in depression through the character's tones. These Victorian elements create the sense that the knight is riding on to his own death. There is a juxtaposition in the poem used on lines 19 to 21. As the shade gives directions to the knight, he tells him to go over the mountains of the moon, and then directly after on line 21, down the valley of the shadow. The juxtaposition on these lines is used to give contrast between the positive and negative aspects of the poem. The high points, such as the moon and the mountains, reflect the confidence that the knight has initially. The valley of the shadow shows the decline of the journey and goes along with the biblical allusion referring to hell, ultimately illustrating the knight's death. There is an allusion on line 21 referring to the Bible, describing hell, as cited from Psalm 23, verse 4. Imagery is used throughout the poem in giving the reader a mental image of a knight on a horse galloping along a trail, going on a journey through many days and nights.
Personification is portrayed in the closing stanza to help convey the meaning of the poem and that the knight ends up dying. The personification is the shade replying to the knight, and shade is not an actual perceived living thing. This stanza is significant because the shade is telling the knight to travel down the valley of the shadow. The valley of the shadow is interpreted as hell, so the shade is an image that the knight is imagining because the shade is leading him to death, whereas the knight thinks he is heading for Eldorado. The type of meter is both iambic and trochaic. Iambic means that lines start with unaccented words and then are followed by an accented word, and trochaic is the opposite. In this poem, some lines are iambic and some are trochaic. The meter of the poem, or the pronunciations of the syllables in the words, are utilized in the structure of the poem to help shape meaning. Since the meter sounds like a song that was sung to the rhythm of the hooves of the horse that the knight was riding on his journey, the rhythm of the poem parallels the knight's journey. However, it changes on lines 22 to 24. On these lines, the emphasis of the words no longer go with the galloping of the horse, but rather create a pause. This pause in the rhythm reflects the death of the knight on his journey, because it is a break in the meter, directly after the line, down the valley of the shadow. Poe's reference of the valley of the shadow is describing hell, and as the ghost directs him to hell, there is a pause in the rhythm of the journey, showing how it has ended, and that he has died.
The third line in each stanza ends in the word shadow. Also, each stanza ends in the word Eldorado. Both of these lines in each stanza are not indented like all the others. The mutual connection between the rhyming phrases in each stanza shows the connection and relationship between the phrases. Since each stanza has a B ending in shadow and a D ending in Eldorado, this continues the pattern and symbolizes the connection between the shadow and Eldorado. In the interpretation, the shadow is resembling hell, and Eldorado is the city of gold, showing how striving for greed will bring one to hell.
Unlike the others, in each stanza, both of these lines are not indented. This structure shows connection between the meaning of the two lines. In each stanza, these lines refer to shadow and Eldorado, or the city of gold. This structure displays a connection between the reoccurring themes of greed and self-demoralization, and further explains how the knight's strong desire for this golden city leads to his demise.
The point of view is from the reader's perspective. The readers feel like they are either taking part in or watching the riders seek Eldorado. This happens through the meter of the poem, having the rhythm of the horses galloping down a trail while journeying. In this poem, the riders are taking their horses to Eldorado, and the readers are able to view this through a third person's view.
Voice is given to the knight as he speaks to the shade with a feeling of exhaustion and hopelessness. This voice is exemplified by the fact that his search for gold is a failure, and there is a clear change in voice as this happens. It is given through the dynamic emotions throughout the poem, as the knight's strength and elation changes into misery and weakness. The change of the voice shapes meaning by reiterating the fact that the journey comes to an end.
Through both of the characters' tones, the story has a dark sound to it. Characterization between earlier stanzas and the later ones show how the character has gone from a positive tone to a negative tone, creating an overall mood change. The original tone of the knight is happy and ready to accomplish his goal of finding the gold in Eldorado. But as the poem continues, the knight is in disbelief that he cannot find Eldorado and begins to use a negative tone. This creates a mood change from a joyous adventure to a slow, somber journey to death. The diction of gaily is in all caps, which shows its carefully chosen language to set the mood of the beginning stanza, showing that the knight has self-confidence in himself and is in a happy state of mind.
The word gallant describes the knight as very brave and bold, which also reiterates the self-confidence and positive thinking that he has. The word singing shows the knight's happiness and joy on the beginning of his journey, as he is very confident that he will find Eldorado. This shows that in the earlier stanzas, the choice of diction allowed for the knight to express his happy, optimistic emotional state.
Later, the diction changes and starts to use many negative terms such as failed, shade, shadow, in context with death. The language enhances the meaning of the poem with these negative adjectives to parallel the theme of darkness and death.
Poe's diction contrasts throughout the poem, as he uses words such as strength and old. Poe uses these words which are opposites, as old implies weakness in the poem. The choice of these two words display the story inside the poem, as the knight gets weaker as time goes on. Another pair of contrasting words he uses are sunshine and shade. He places these words at opposite ends of the poem, showing the change of the spectrum from light to darkness.